Okay, well, welcome everyone to this webinar, China, Smithfield, and the Global Meat Industry. Earlier this month, China's largest meat producer, Shuanghui International, announced it would purchase the United States' largest pork producer, Smithfield. The deal illustrates two important trends in the meat industry. One, rapid global corporate concentration. Fewer corporations are controlling the global meat supply, and companies from Brazil and China are becoming major players. Two, China's growing demand for major commodities is influencing the global agricultural economy at large. How China's meat industry develops in the future is particularly important given the industry's climate footprint and dependence on large amounts of grain. China's government increasingly supports the U.S. model of factory-style animal production for scaling up and addressing food safety issues. So what are the motivations behind this deal? And what might be the implications for the U.S. agricultural economy, for rural communities, for export markets, for the environment and public health, and global food security? So when the Shuanghui Smithfield deal was announced, IATP's president, Jim Harkness, and Shefali Sharma were in China investigating the country's meat industry. They talked with government, industry, academic, and farm experts about the deal and where China's meat production and consumption is going in the future. Jim Harkness is IATP's president and spent 15 years in China working for the Ford Foundation and World Wildlife Federation. Shefali Sharma has spent over a decade analyzing international agricultural trade in Geneva and Washington. So we'll have Jim and Shefali present for half an hour or so and then leave time for questions. My name is Ben Lilliston, and I also am at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, and I will moderate those questions. You can see on the right-hand side of your webinar toolbox there's a place to ask questions. So you can ask those at any time during the webinar, and I'll sort of keep track, and then we'll get to as many as we can at the end. Okay, so let's get started. I'm going to turn it over to Shefali.
So if you look at China's domestic consumption of commodities and food as a percentage of the world total, you can see that China already consumes nearly 50% of the world's pork, about 35% of the world's rice, about 25% of the world's soy. So the decisions that China is going to make in this sector are going to be very important. And just to talk about the history, in the 1990s and pre-1990s, Chinese government actually had a legal requirement of 95% of self-sufficiency in staple grains. At that time, the Chinese diet was based almost entirely on grain and vegetables. But you can see that since the 90s, when China started moving towards its economic reforms, one of its priorities was actually to provide food and meat security for the Chinese population. And the Chinese pork consumption and demand as a result in the last 2.5 decades has increased significantly. You can see in this slide the tremendous increase in consumption in China and the relatively stagnant consumption of pork in the U.S. And this next slide shows where China is with its counterparts in Asia as well as the other countries. China is already consuming nearly 70 kg per capita of meat overall, and more than half of that is pork. And in order to meet this demand, obviously, the Chinese government invested a great deal in its meat sector, and particularly in its pork industry. You can see that it has done, the government and the companies that it supports have done a great job, because the Chinese hog herd is nearly 3 times that of the EU. So in 1996, in preparation for the WTO accession, China actually decided to loosen its ideas about self-sufficiency when it came to soy, because soy is such a major feed ingredient for producing all this meat. This was done obviously in response to the rising demand for meat and animal feed, and the idea, and so the idea was to be able to actually import the grains to be able to develop its own industry. And as a result, you can see that the soybean imports in the country have increased tremendously. China now imports more than half of the soy that it's traded internationally, and in 2010, it imported about 55 million metric tons. A large part of that comes from the U.S. and Brazil, as you can see in this slide. Also, because meat has become such an essential part of food security in China, although there are still major discrepancies between rural and urban areas, the government started a strategic pork reserve in 2006, and it utilizes that to be able to manage pork prices. So putting in more pork when prices start to rise for meat, and taking it out of the market when the prices are low. So following the global food price crisis of 2007 and 2008, there was a widespread consensus in policy circles that China won't be able to meet domestic demand for both meat and feed. There's been a huge increase in imports of dried distillers grains and alfalfa, and China has invested heavily in infrastructure for the soy trade in Brazil. So you actually started to see Chinese companies investing in ports and in infrastructure in Brazil to be able to have more control over the feed, over the soy trade itself, and not be so reliant on foreign companies and the dominant grain traders like Cargill and Bunge and others. And just very recently, we've had news that China has approved several new GMO soy varieties. China has actually been quite cautious about approving GM varieties, and in the last couple of days, we've had news that it's approved several new GM soy varieties. So we can see that securing this feed is very critical for Chinese strategy for food security and for meat security. So there have been a number of land and food production investments abroad by Chinese companies, including other ventures into meat and dairy production. We hear about Chinese companies moving into Australia and New Zealand, acquiring dairy farms, actually importing live cattle. But there's a fierce debate about how much China should be dependent on importation of meat to meet this demand versus continuing to focus on importing feed and raising animals in the country. So feed is a very critical element of China's import-export decisions and of the global meat industry as a whole. I think as we move forward, looking at demand projections, you know, the OECD and FAO is just coming out with a report now that's saying that there's going to be an 80% increase in global meat demand. So what does that mean in terms of the feed needs for this industry? So you can see here that China's livestock already, you know, there's a significant domestic grain consumption for the livestock industry. Nearly 70% of China's corn is used for livestock compared to 40% by the U.S. And Morgan Stanley predicts 4% growth per year in demand for corn by 2015 and up to 12% for wheat, because China also actually uses a lot of wheat for its livestock feed as well. 14% of domestic wheat was used, for instance, last year for livestock, which is about 15 million metric tons. So it's a significant amount of grain. And you can see that corn imports are also rising as a result, although corn is not one of those grains that China considers. Basically, corn has been a key element of its food security strategy as well. But you can see that in the last couple of years, the corn imports are rising. I mean, it's 1.5 million metric tons compared to the 55 million metric tons of soy, but this is something that industry analysts, those like Rabobank and Morgan Stanley, are all watching carefully. And I think this is an open question about, as China's meat demand increases, how much corn is it going to have to import over time, especially since the priority of the state right now is to not depend on corn imports. So the government has been restructuring the Chinese meat industry to meet this enormous Chinese demand for meat. And in this process, and also because a whole host of environmental, food safety, and resource constraint problems have cropped up, China uses 6% of the world's total water for agriculture and for everything else, even though it's 1/5 of the world's population, and it has very limited arable land. One of the figures is 0.08 hectares per person, whereas the global average is about 0.2 hectares per person, land availability. So they're dealing with major resource constraints, and the massive expansion of production in the last decades has created enormous environmental problems. China's first pollution census in 2010 found that animal manure is the country's biggest source of water pollution. And China has also obviously been plagued by industry outbreaks, disease outbreaks like the blue-eared pig disease in 2008, which killed over 1 million animals. And just this year, we've seen the bird flu created havoc in the industry. So those are very real concerns, and as a result, you can see that the Chinese industry, the government has been trying to incentivize with investments, with subsidies, with government policies, a restructuring of the Chinese pork industry. You were seeing a much lower component of backyard farming, small farmers who own 1 or 2 pigs who feed scraps from the house, and a much larger component of what they call specialized farms, which are family farms plus. So they can be very huge. They can be anywhere between 50 pigs to 3,000 pigs. And then you can see an increase over time with commercialized farms, over 3,000 pigs per farm. But what you're also seeing is a rapid consolidation in slaughtering and processing. You can, Rabobank and others, they're predicting that there's going to be much rapid consolidation of the amount of processing facilities, and Jim's going to talk a little bit about that, but there's an overcapacity right now. Because there are such about 10 or 11 major companies who have huge processing facilities, and they acquire pigs from all over. And there was a large number of investment done into that. You're actually finding that that there's a lot more processing capacity, and I think in that context, the Smithfield deal is very interesting to look at. So this debate is continuing today in terms of, how much should China import? Should China import feed and produce meat at home, or should China just import meat and basically externalize all the environmental and health costs? So there are those in China, and some ministry officials say that most ministry officials are in favor of this, increasing meat imports, and that the agriculture ministry is really the only one fighting for importing soy and raising pigs in China. But then there are others who are saying, actually we've invested a great deal in our meat industry, so we need to continue focusing on importing raw materials and adding value in the country, which will increase incomes and increase jobs as well. So with that, I will pass it over to Jim to talk about why this deal now.
Thanks, Shefali. Shefali's been talking a bit about the bigger context of the Smithfield deal in the context of Chinese food security, rapid Chinese development and growing demand, and attitudes toward food security in the country. There's clearly both a political need on the part of the Chinese government to guarantee people the meat that they want, and an economic opportunity for profit here with the very large and growing demand that China has for more meat. But what's in it for Shuanghui in particular? Well, Shuanghui is China's biggest pork producer, or pork slaughterer, but they only actually raise a small proportion of the hogs that they process. They slaughter about 11 million head a year, but only raise about 400,000 hogs. So they're looking for a more dependable supply, and they also have a problem with overcapacity. So Shuanghui has talked about being very interested in learning from Smithfield's model, which is very highly vertically integrated, and to find a way to replicate that inside of China to guarantee a good supply of live hogs within the country. Of course, this wasn't just Shuanghui's idea. Smithfield also sees this as a very smart economic move. On one hand, Morgan Stanley has picked Smithfield as a winner for pork imports to China back in October 2011. And Morgan Stanley, in fact, is set to be an important financier of this deal. But in fact, Smithfield's business overall has suffered in recent years because of high feed prices, also because they've had trouble exporting to China due to China's ban on the use of ractopamine, a veterinary drug that promotes lean pork growth. And it was just recently revealed that their profits were down something like 63% in the first quarter of 2013 due to that ban. So it's in Smithfield's interest to go forward. If it goes through, though, the question is what would happen next. And of course, that's a question mark, and nobody has ever made a lot of money trying to predict the future in China, that's for sure. But I think we can talk about some of the main potential impacts in different categories. Now, despite some early reports in the United States, this merger is very unlikely to lead to Chinese pork being imported into U.S. markets. The growth market, as we saw from an earlier slide, really is in China. Demand in the U.S. and in the EU, for that matter, has really been flat for 30 or 40 years. And in addition, hogs are something like 30% less expensive to raise here in the United States than in China. For that reason, there would likely be increased exports, and of course this is what Shuanghui and Smithfield have both said about the deal, that it could lead to increased exports of U.S.-raised pork to China. Chinese consumers also value many cuts of pork that Americans don't, such as the head, feet, and offal. So there are opportunities there even without a substantial increase in production within the United States. But while raising pigs is cheaper in the United States, processing and marketing is much more expensive here. So a number of experts that we talked to in China suggested that Shuanghui would just export whole slaughtered hogs and process them in China. This would change production lines and affect jobs at U.S. slaughterhouses and processing facilities. We also heard arguments in China, including from Rabobank, that in assuming they'll be able to import large quantities of pork, Shuanghui is ignoring a very important other Chinese consumer taste, which is their preference for fresh as opposed to frozen pork. Rabobank and several Chinese observers said that U.S. imports would likely be for low-end uses like filling dumplings and military canteens and low-end consumer markets, whereas the higher-end production would stay in China, as well as the processing and developing things like ham and sausages. What about food safety? This was, of course, another one of the prominent concerns raised within the United States when this deal was first proposed. And ironically, especially given both Shuanghui in particular and China in general having a rather poor record on food safety, this deal's short-term effect seems to be to actually be improving U.S. food safety standards in one respect. I mentioned ractopamine earlier, and due to industry pressure, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration has refused so far to ban ractopamine, but it is banned in China as well as in the EU and many other countries. And so this has been a big obstacle for U.S. pork exports, not just to China, but to other places as well, and has especially hit Smithfield. So in preparation for this deal, and in hopes of increasing its shipments to China going forward, Smithfield has already stopped using ractopamine in half of its U.S. operations. There's been some very good reporting by Helene Bottomiller on this issue in Food Safety News and other places. Now, if such a large player in the U.S. industry were to drop ractopamine entirely, it could really have the effect of spurring similar action by others hoping for access to Chinese and European markets. So it's a kind of a counterintuitive possible impact of this that I think also speaks to the fact that, as well as in environment and other areas, food safety standards in U.S. are no longer certainly the highest in the world. One Chinese analyst we spoke to, though, actually argued this the other way. He pointed out that regulators in China are very worried about production practices of Chinese industry, not just about drugs and feed additives themselves, but especially about how they're used and misused. So it's possible that going forward, Shuanghui Smithfield could argue that ractopamine is used entirely differently and much more safely in U.S. pork production, and actually try to get Chinese regulators to make an exception to the ban, but for U.S. raised hogs only. So the ractopamine ban would continue in China, but actually be relaxed for imports. Some other impacts within the United States, from expanded exports would be environmental ones and public health and worker impacts. As we've seen earlier, China consumes 6 times as much pork as we do in the United States, and our exports are currently meeting only a tiny fraction of that demand. So if the Smithfield deal leads to a substantial increase in those exports, it'll definitely benefit the hog raising sector in the U.S. But we would also be looking at higher prices for both feed and potentially for pork in the United States. And the other important point is that hog raising in the U.S. is very capital intensive, and it has very negative environmental impacts. So the environmental, public health, and economic costs could be high with relatively little return in the form of jobs, especially given the fact that it may largely be whole hogs that are being, whole hog carcasses that are being exported rather than finished cuts and sausages. The other question that's been raised by Rabobank, among others, is the degree to which export dependency is a good thing for the U.S. meat industry. Currently, the U.S. meat industry exports about 22% of their production, and if that were to go up substantially, there is certainly an exposure there. And as Chinese observers have pointed out, with the prevalence of the sensitivity to both food safety and disease issues, it's very easy for those kinds of international flows to be cut off at a moment's notice and for extended periods of time, as we saw with avian flu and with mad cow disease. What about impacts outside of the U.S. and China? Well, certainly food security is an important one to consider. In 1994, Lester Brown wrote his famous book, Who Will Feed China? It was a book that claimed that China's growing demand for grain would actually push up international prices and lead to mass starvation in poor countries around the world. That was 1994, and for almost 2 decades, his prediction didn't come true. And the reason for this were those grain self-sufficiency policies that Shefali talked about, including the large grain reserve system. The Smithfield deal comes at a moment when all of those policies are being called into question, when government analysts in China are saying, greater reliance on global markets for meat and grain may not be a bad thing. And of course, when you import meat, in a sense, you're importing grain in another form. And this is also a time when Chinese companies are investing in food production abroad in a variety of different ways, including land investments as well as acquisition of companies. So the question of how much of China's demand can be met domestically, its demand for protein and its demand for meat, going forward is an open one. Rabobank has talked about the possibility of China actually increasing its productivity for pork and being able to meet that demand, but many others are skeptical. Another issue to consider here, as Ben mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, is the question of corporate concentration. This acquisition is just the latest in a series of mergers and acquisitions that have made the industry, the meat industry, which is already very concentrated within the United States, controlled by a smaller and smaller set of players worldwide. And when we were in China, it was very interesting. One of the economists we talked to said, nobody's really making money in China's hog raising industry through increased innovation or competitiveness or providing better products. He said that the profits are primarily monopoly profits that come through mergers and acquisitions. People swallowing up smaller companies and other practices that control markets, like forcing farmers to buy feed from your feed company and having farmers with a contract that requires them to have their hogs slaughtered at your slaughtering facility. So it's really a matter of integration and monopoly power rather than markets that are simply operating in a way that's more efficient in terms of generating jobs and prosperity and healthy food supply. And this is really our concern when we look at deals like the Smithfield deal. The fact that the corporations that are now increasingly controlling our food supply are not really interested primarily in food security or the environment or livelihoods of rural people, but in maximizing profits and shareholder value. So I think there's good reason to question the wisdom of putting control of our food supply entirely in their hands. The final issue that I want to leave people with briefly, and I want to leave plenty of time for questions, is this issue of whose interests are best served by and are really behind this particular deal. The media on both sides of the Pacific have talked about this either as one of China, as in sort of the Chinese government or the Chinese Communist Party, buying up one of America's biggest companies, or at the very least of a Chinese meat company buying an American meat company. But strictly speaking, this actually isn't the case. The merger or the acquisition is being proposed by Shuanghui International, which is a Cayman Island registered corporation and a separate corporate entity from Shuanghui Development, which is China's largest meat processor. And several observers have pointed out the significance of this. Shuanghui International has a majority control of Shuanghui Development, and this gets a little convoluted. But the fact is that Shuanghui International is controlled by a group of international investors led by the private equity firm CDH, which is based in China but is actually mostly backed by Western money, including the Rockefeller Foundation, CalPERS, and others. And Shuanghui International is also owned by Goldman Sachs, Temasek Holdings from Singapore, and the Kerry Group. So what we're seeing really is not a Chinese company buying an American company, but really a financial deal, a leverage buyout by private equity firms. And one reason that this is likely happening is because of the difficulty that private equity firms have had in getting their money out of their Chinese investments. We can talk about it more during the Q&A, but the notion is that Shuanghui International, after borrowing several $billion from the Bank of China and others for this deal, is going to relist Smithfield in Hong Kong and cash in on the initial public offering in several years. and that's how they'll get their cash out. The question in the meantime is how they'll service the debt they have. And this has raised concerns both in the U.S. and in China. Ma Guangyan, a blogger who is quoted by an HSBC market newsletter, has said, if Shuanghui International acquires Smithfield and sells the meat at high prices to Shuanghui Development, which is the in-China company, this will increase profits for the privatized Smithfield, but it may not do much to help Shuanghui Development. So if this sort of dealing, this sort of kind of internal trading in order to service the debt happens, it's likely to attract a lot of attention from China's internal financial regulators. And so I think that, there's already quite a lot of buzz about this within China on economic and business blogs. So although, you know, the concerns, to the extent that there are concerns on the part of some that the deal might not go through, have mostly been directed within the United States at the commission that looks into foreign investment in the U.S. In fact, you know, it's not out of the question that there will be considerable scrutiny of this deal by Chinese financial regulators as well. So I think that its certainty, both the initial acquisition and the strategies going forward, remain, you know, just somewhat in question. But the bigger issue that points to, again, is the fact that decisions about our food supply are really being made by financial investors that are looking for a quick return and an opportunity for an exit strategy. They're not being made on the basis of broad public concerns like food security, public health, and the effect that this massive globalized industry has on our environment. So I'm going to just stop there and so that we can open it up for questions. Hand it back to our tech folks.
Okay, great. This is Ben again, and thanks Jeff and Shefali for that presentation. We do have a series of questions, and people, if they want to ask more, feel free. It should be in your right-hand column and a box to ask questions. So go ahead and send them in, and we'll just get through as many as we can. So one question was a point of clarification on a statistic that Shefali gave about amount of land available per capita in China, and it is 0.08 hectares per capita compared to 0.2 hectares per capita as a world average. So just getting that out of the way. Okay, first question. Is growing Chinese demand for meat likely to have an impact on feed prices for U.S. capos, or are they insulated due to high levels of U.S. grain production?
Shefali, you want to take that?
Sure, I'm trying to look at the whole thing. Well, I mean, I guess the big question is China going to continue to increase its corn imports? And if so, you know, one of the slides that I showed in this thing, if you look at the 2010 corn imports, most of them are from the U.S. So, show my screen. And you know, if you talk to the U.S. Grains Council, and if you talk to other people who are really interested in increasing that grain supply, U.S. corn growers are supposed to benefit from this. So obviously that's going to have an impact on corn prices, because corn prices are already high because of the competition that it's facing for biofuels. And so there's this big tension between, you know, what happens between feed and fuel. And when you add China's demand to that question, and climate change, and currency fluctuations, I think that that's going to have a significant impact. just how much China is going to increase its corn imports, I guess, depends on whether Chinese technology improves so significantly that their feed to meat conversion ratio actually decreases over time. And I think this is one of the reasons why Rabobank is saying that perhaps China is going to be able to meet its meat demand even just by the technological changes. And I think in that context, the Smithfield deal is very interesting because people are wondering, you know, is Smithfield, are they trying to get Smithfield because they want to import, or are they trying to get Smithfield so that they can learn everything that Smithfield does to become, you know, one of the largest pork processors in the world? And will they be able to take that technology abroad? But yeah, I mean, my guess is that if U.S. corn starts to go to China in a significant manner, that's definitely going to affect corn prices, not just for CAFOs in the U.S., but corn prices worldwide.
Okay, thanks, Polly. Just a quick sort of follow-up question to that then. If U.S. feed prices are likely to increase, then what are the implications for the U.S. model of animal agriculture? I know feed prices are a key component that make that sort of CAFO model work. Jim, what do you think?
Well, obviously, anytime there's something driving up feed prices, industry is opposed to it because it makes them relatively less competitive. And we saw that in the interesting alliances that grew up to oppose the renewable fuel standard and biofuels mandates. So I think that you know, we don't know what the magnitude would be, but it certainly would make production within the United States less competitive. And we've already seen in the losses that Smithfield incurred in the last several years the impact that higher feed prices have on their business model. And that was one reason that some analysts were surprised at Shuanghui's interest. Was they were saying, well, this is a money-losing company who's in and Continental Grain and other investors, shareholders, have at different times proposed breaking up Smithfield because there was a sense that the hog production was not economically viable. So if we see grain prices going up and feed prices going up further, it would further, you know, undermine a system that depends very much on cheap feed.
Okay, let's move on to the next question. What could be the consequences of Smithfield's buy-up on Smithfield's activities in the U.S.? That is, its organization of activities, business units. And what about the company's subsidiaries in Europe, whether in Spain and Romania, Poland? Any thoughts on how it could affect the company worldwide, inside and outside the U.S.?
We heard from allies who work with. We heard from allies who work with food processing workers in the Midwest a year or so ago about changes in the line and changes in the production and speed-ups that were happening that workers reported having heard from managers had to do with redirecting their product to China, and in the short term, those were you know, because companies are trying to keep labor costs low, you know, the speed ups of the line, which, you know, lead to a greater frequency of worker safety problems and a greater frequency, perhaps, or greater difficulty in maintaining food safety standards could be one outcome. There's also this question of, you know, the degree to which Smithfield would be exporting finished products like ham and sausages or finer cuts as opposed to whole carcasses. That's a very different set of production practices and workforce that you're talking about. So depending on the approach that's taken, it could have you know, quite major impacts on the operations here. The Chinese business press, one of the reactions of the Chinese business press to this deal was to very pointedly mention the high labor costs in U.S. Meat production. Certainly within the United States, we don't think of the costs of labor in either in CAFOs or slaughtering facilities to be inordinately high, but certainly by Chinese standards they would be. And although Shuanghui made a commitment to Smithfield to keep on its 46,000 employees, I would not. I think that's going to be a real cost consideration along with feed that the retooled Smithfield will need to take into consideration. The question about Smithfield's operations in other parts of the world is very interesting in that connection because, of course, in Eastern Europe you have other sources of grain for feed and a potentially lower cost workforce. So there are another phenomenon to track and going forward will be whether rather than solely or primarily relying on its U.S. operations to supply exports to China, the retooled Smithfield might actually move more production to countries where those production costs are lower.
Okay, we have a question about what is the anticipated impact on the animals in terms of humane treatment? Current conditions are abysmal in many CAFO operations. How could this deal affect animals or treat animal welfare issues?
I think that's really hard to say. It certainly the phenomenon that it's a part of is one that is a matter of great concern, and to the effect that larger and larger facilities mean you have when there is for instance a disease outbreak, you have a much greater risk of a large number of animals being affected. But I think it's really uncertain what the impacts will be, and I think that Shuanghui claims that their hope is to learn from the world-class hog production practices of Smithfield rather than to transfer Shuanghui's own systems here. So we'll, I guess, take them at their word about that. Yeah, that's all I have to add.
Yeah, maybe I can just add. I just wrote a blog where we talk about the practices here as the person who was asked the question. I mean, the treatment of animals in CAFOs here is pretty abysmal to begin with, and I think the challenge in China is that there are all kinds of systems. So when you talk about the specialized farms over there, 51%, there can be all kinds of situations and setups for those pigs. And what China wants to do is to kind of standardize these practices and consolidate and create more concentrated facilities. So that, obviously concentration creates much more difficulties for the way that that animals are treated. And I guess the challenge is, again, this demand question and how much China is planning on importing. And, I was speaking to one of the folks who works with workers in meat packing plants, and what they're saying is that a 10% increase in demand for U.S. pork will raise pork production in this country by 50%. So what does that mean for the number of animals and the way that they're treated here? And I don't see that that's going to be a good thing for animal welfare. And I think in addition to this is this whole notion that that folks who are working on livestock are trying to do precisely for this feed question, which is to make animals much more efficient in converting feed into meat. and coming up with technological fixes for diets and things like that to be able to mitigate the climate footprint. And I think all of those things basically mean treating the animal as a commodity and not as a living being, and I think that's going to create problems for animal welfare.
Okay. Another question: what is the role of the Chinese government in encouraging imports of feed in terms of regulations or incentives? What do they do? What's their role in sort of creating this meat industry?
Maybe I'll say a few things, and then Shefali, if you want to add anything or maybe correct me. Certainly, when the decision was made about soy, basically to sort of deregulate the trade in soy and allow large imports, and the demand for soy and soy, both for feed and for cooking oil, was high in China. The government pretty much let open the floodgates, and there was a tremendous amount of foreign direct investment and ownership in soy crushing facilities in China, so that in fact estimates were something 70 or 80% of that industry was foreign owned. That happened to the detriment of China's soy farmers, because the owners of those crushing facilities also had their own supply of grain, of lower cost soy that they could import from the U.S. and Brazil. And so even though the facilities were built in China's soy growing areas initially, they were actually not built for the benefit of China's soy farmers. So this became quite when millions of China's soy farmers went out of business, it became an issue, a political issue, and China's government moved in to more heavily regulate that sector. There is, I think, a misperception internationally that China's entire economy is owned and controlled by the state, including all of its different industries, and really, petroleum, defense, finance to a large extent, and some of the grain trade are controlled by the state. But China largely uses a whole range of other regulatory and incentive systems, including the ones mentioned in the question: taxes, regulations, special programs, that have been their ways to guide industrial growth, rather than relying on large state-owned enterprises. Shefali, is there anything you wanted to add for feed?
No, I don't think I have too much to add. I mean, I think it's as I was saying, I think there are multiple strategies being used. One is the government support that Jim has talked about. The other is obviously developing the kind of vertical infrastructure that they can have to compete with the other major grain traders, which we've seen happening in Brazil. So I think that there are numerous strategies being used in terms of investment and state support.
For instance, there is a 10,000 pig farm policy that basically gives a financial reward to any production facility once it reaches the level of producing 10,000 head a year. So that's just sort of an example of the kinds of ways that the government intervenes, and intervenes very much in favor of large-scale and consolidated production.
Okay, next question. Given some of the problems with meat production, whether it's climate change or environmental and resource use impact, as well as animal welfare, the question is, shouldn't we be advocating for a reduction in meat consumption globally? And I think that leads probably to my question of, that's one question. Another aspect of that is, there's all these projections in China. Is Is it going to increase that much? I mean, how far can they go in terms of increasing meat consumption? Did you hear differing opinions about that in China?
Shefali, you want to take that first? I had some conversations after you left, so I probably will have something to add, but what do you?
Sure. I think those are really good questions. Should we be advocating for less meat? By all means, I mean, if we look at the ecological footprint of the expansion of meat consumption, you know, it's staggering when you start to look at it, and this is why I was really very interested in understanding China's need for corn and soy and how self-sufficient they are, because they're kind of teetering on that corn front right now, you know, and they're trying to innovate. They've just gotten a deal with the U.S. USDA on importing rice bran for feed, and they're using wheat, and they're trying to use corn, and trying not to import corn. And this question about demand is a really good one, because you know there are a lot of projections, and if you read the Morgan Stanley report, it seems like the demand is just insatiable, and that everyone who is a grain trader and a meat processor is going to just make it big. And obviously Morgan Stanley is putting its money there, right? Because they want to help make this acquisition, help finance this acquisition. So how reliable are the demand figures? I mean, most of the folks that we spoke to, you know, use some proxy measures about, you know, taking the state's data on the production and then looking at the import data of you know, pork imports to kind of figure out, okay, that's the total consumption. There have been several surveys done, and so they try and look at that as well, because a lot of the household surveys don't really look at eating out. So then there have been some eating out surveys done, and they try to put together these things. But I think what's important is, one, yes, to take the demand figures with a grain of salt, but also to understand that in China right now, there's an enormous concern about food safety. So while this deal is creating huge concerns about food safety here, and those food safety concerns should be here regardless of whether this merger takes place or not. I mean, when you look at the antibiotic resistance problems being faced in this country alone and what is being done to address them, it's very scary. And this problem has been compounded in China in terms of antibiotic resistance. And the government's quite concerned about it. And consumers are very concerned about food safety, not just about meat, but of all kinds of products. And it's actually hurting, you know, industries in China, agro-processing industries, because people want to buy foreign foods instead. And so this is a big concern, and I think that is going to affect demand. I mean, Jim and I, some of the pictures that we have up on our website are of community-supported agricultural farms, because those are starting up in China and in cities, because people are concerned about their food supply and the quality of their food. So we'll have to see how this all plays out. You know, and I think the consumption angle is very significant.
I would say what I would add is that not all meat is created equally, and as Shefali mentioned, I had a similar experience. I like to go through the ag and sections of bookstores in China to see what sort of issues people are talking about, and I was shocked that unlike just a couple of years ago, there were a dozen or more books that were practical technical manuals for pasture-raised poultry or free-range pork production in the Chinese bookstores that I visited. So there is a demand for meat that is not industrially raised and that is raised in ways that are more humane. You know, there are, you know, of the world's billion poorest people, about 70% of them are directly dependent on livestock for their livelihoods in one way or another, either as food, as a source of income, or as draft animals. And so, you know, a blanket message about reducing meat consumption, I think, makes a lot of sense for the urban middle class, where there's clearly overconsumption, and makes a lot of sense if the meat we're talking about is produced in ways that are harmful to the environment and to the animals, and in many cases to the workers. But I think it's targeting that industrial process and that particular type of meat and type of consumption, rather than meat per se. That would be our proposal.
Okay, we're running out of time. I'm going to do one more question here, and apologies to some of the people who asked additional questions. But one is, how do the major grain companies like Cargill feel about the merger? Are they involved in discussions in China about the choice between imported grain versus meat? So what presence do we see of Cargill, ADM, and some of the other global grain companies in China? Shefali?
You know, I didn't, in my conversations with people, I didn't hear about what Cargill and others were saying about this or positioning themselves as. Cargill and ADM and others are there, as Jim pointed out, in the soy crushing industry. They kind of monopolize that, although the Chinese government since 2008 has been trying to kind of untangle itself from that kind of corporate control by the ABCDs, the four major grain traders in this. But you know, but we were hearing about examples of Wilmar and others actually buying rice in Northeast China. So China's so big, it's very hard to kind of have anything definitive said about what's actually going on in any particular aspect. But Cargill is one of the four that is actually integrated both in the soy crushing but also in the feed mill. So Cargill has this Purina feed mill, feed brand that it sells in China as feed, which is you know, so. And there are a lot of domestic feed companies, so I'm sure they're waiting and watching to see what happens with this. I don't see how they're going to lose with this merger, because Cargill, you know, you can see in Jim's slide, they're there in the meat as one of the top 10 meat producers, but this merger only means more feed, right? So, and they're going to be involved in that feed equation one way or the other. So I'm not sure how much Cargill stands to lose from this merger. I only see gains, but maybe other people have opinions about that. Jim?
Okay, thanks very much, Shefali, and thanks very much to everyone who participated in this webinar. We will send out a follow-up email to everyone who signed up, and that will include a link to the whole webinar. If you have follow-up questions, you know, you can reach Jim or Shefali. We'll send contact information maybe in that email, or it's easy to go to our website, and there's additional information up there about this project that we're in the middle of. So thanks very much. Great questions, and see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.